While there is no one way to creating a career path in journalism today, Leah Sottile is an investigative journalist in all the ways. Writing articles and creating podcasts and Substacks, teaching journalism.
Since I got here, I've had conversations with so many students about how to do this job and get over the fear of pissing people off. I told them you get rid of that feeling when you realize you're defending truth and facts.
And writing books.
How can a mother do this to their children?
Author Leah Sottile says that question is part of the reason people across the nation have been so invested in the case ever since Lori Vallow's 2 young children went missing, later found buried in her 5th husband's backyard. Sottile, who used to live and work in Spokane, recently wrote the book When the Moon Turns to Blood and says the Vallow case quickly grew a lot darker than anyone had allowed themselves to realize.
Beliefs of people on the fringes rivet Sottile's attention, and then ours.
But I think also within this New Age world, there have been a history of people who have exploited people looking for answers to personally benefit.
Telling those stories matter, and we are here for it. Joining Leah Sottile on stage is journalist Emma Epperly. Please welcome them both to the Northwest Passages stage.
Hi, everybody. Thanks for coming out tonight. I hope you all are ready to hear about some weird stuff.
Yeah, there's a lot. We have a lot to cover.
Yes. Let's just start. Your book just came out this week, so can you just tell us a little bit about what it's all about?
Yeah, that's a big question. So I have spent over a decade now covering far-right extremism and kind of the fringes of our political environment. And I decided after I finished my first book, which is, you got a little preview of what it's about, that I wanted to not write about extremism anymore. So I started writing about stuff that I was interested in. I live in Portland. There's like a crystal shop on every corner. You can, kind of get this vibe that this New Age thing is a really big deal. And so I started looking into it. I'd heard a bit about this group called Love Has Won in Colorado, and before I knew it, I was writing another book on extremism. So I'm broken. This is where I am at this point. But, I just think it's a really interesting thing. And with this book, it's about New Age ideologies, but it's also, you hear that saying, like, if you go far enough to the right or far enough to the left, the ideas start to meet each other. And so, I keep talking about this book as like, this is the intersection point. This is where people who may present as really politically different find shared ideas.
I think for a lot of people, and especially for me before I read your book, New Age ideas just seemed kind of like a vibe. And, crystals and they're hard to pin down. So how did you go about pinning down what New Age is?
Yeah, okay, so it took a long time. I think that what I realized is I was writing like a book on a really loosey-goosey sort of thing and trying to apply like a serious fact-based reporting to a thing that's just vibes, like you say. So there were certain things that I was interested in, and really what I was what drove the reporting was an interest in female power, good or bad, what that looks like, and how women find a place of standing for themselves within spirituality. So that kind of gave me some characters to concentrate on. And so I started to try to find what their shared ideas were. So, you had people who believe in the lost civilization of Lemuria. You have people who, use tarot cards and believe in aliens and that they're, ascended, godlike beings. So that would kind of give me some criteria of where to start and where this book would go and what not to include. So there's no yoga in this book. There's no, there's certain things that I just had to keep out to kind of keep the reporting focused on the people who are in it.
Yeah, that's a thing we all hear from our editors is, can we narrow the scope a little bit?
Yeah, and when you're kind of your own editor, it's daunting. And I had to do tons and tons and tons of research into things where I was like, reading. It was an interesting book for a lot of reasons for the research, because there's not a lot of fact-based reporting on a thing that, as you say, is vibes. So, I was reading a lot about Atlantis and a lot about channelers and, people who are channeling spirits from a place that didn't really exist, and trying to find, things to kind of hold on to go forward. But I do think that this is like a theme that I've started to realize in my work, is that I am often willing to apply a serious lens to topics that other journalists won't take seriously. I think that's how I ended up writing so much about extremism. I think a lot of the people that I've written about are folks that, at a certain point in time, you could be like, yeah, those people, they believe that, but they're never going to be in power. Obviously, we're all getting, a piece of humble pie there. But I do think that this is where, I thrive, is kind of in looking at things. And sometimes the stories I write are really funny. I've written a lot about Bigfoot, but, sometimes they lead to things like this.
Okay, I'm going to ask you a question that's kind of a deep cut in this book, but there's one person, Kim, in this book who is kind of a member of Love Has Won, but she never leaves her house. And I thought that was very poignant, that this impacted her life so much, but it was just a voice on the radio or ideas on a computer screen. How did you find her, and how did you decide to feature her so prominently? Yeah,
so I had heard about Love Has Won when I was writing about Lori Vallow, because there were so many rumors around that case, and somebody had said at one point, that some of Lori's friends were members of Love Has Won. It didn't turn out to be true, but it kind of put them on my radar. So I started looking at them, and then obviously, for a lot of reasons I get into in the book, the group falls apart, and I started looking for people who had been in the group that were willing to talk. HBO tied up a lot of people with agreements to cooperate in a documentary. So there were people that were really close to the leader that I couldn't talk to until really late in my reporting. But I started to find all these people who were online members. So Kim is somebody who lived, the group was based in Colorado. She lives in far eastern Canada. And she was so wrapped up in this group that basically she was waiting for the border to open after COVID so she could leave her family, and a family that she loved, because she thought she had to be near the leader of the group. And so it was, to me, when you're writing about extremism, I'm always thinking about, I want to advance the conversation and try to understand things more. I don't want to just keep treading in the same territory. Other reporters can do that if they want to. With this, I started to ask people who are religious studies scholars and cult experts, can a cult exist only online? And they were like, oh, absolutely. Why, as a cult leader, would you not want to capitalize on the entire internet to fund your group and your existence? And so that was a very sobering thing for me to learn. And it was amazing for me, specifically with Kim, who gave me so much of her time for this book, to understand how deep somebody can sink their claws into a person and exploit them and never even meet them.
So let's talk a little bit about Love Has Won. How did you decide? I think when you look at the cover of the book, you might think, oh, this book's about Love Has Won. And it's the through line of your book. It's about so much more. But how did you decide to make this specific group kind of the through line?
Yeah. So it started when I started seeing reports. This is, not really a spoiler, but Amy Carlson, who referred to herself as Mother God and was the leader of Love Has Won, she died in 2021. So I started reading a lot of the stories that were written about her, and a lot of them were very, disregarded her and kind of made fun of her for reasons, she sort of welcomed, I think. But in a lot of the reports, they would talk about how she believed she had been reincarnated 524 times, this very specific number. And she lived as Cleopatra, she lived as Joan of Arc, and she lived as the Queen of Lemuria. And I just kept seeing that reported over and over, and I was like, what is that? What is Lemuria? Is this a thing I should know about? Started looking, as I do, at what that is, and just was kind of surprised that kept getting repeated. I didn't know if people knew what that was. I didn't know what that was. So when I realized Lemuria is a supposed lost civilization that was once spiritually realized, but humans basically erred enough that it sunk to the bottom of the ocean with Atlantis. I was like, people really believe that? And I think that when I asked that question, that is when I'm going to end up doing a lot of reporting. Like at one point, I was like, people really believe in QAnon? People really believe in the Proud Boys? Like, and that usually is like, then I'm going to write a big project about it. So it was really that, it was that reason. It was because she died. And then I just wanted to know, how does someone's brain start to believe that stuff? And I thought, the way it was reported, it was like it was really unique, and it wasn't. This book is like a long history of people who have very much believed those things, and it's their spiritual beliefs.
So one thing I thought that was really interesting is we've got Atlantis and Lemuria and all these really out there ideas, but that people often ask, like, do people really believe that? And then they're all tied to these ideas that are very common, sadly, in our society, like racism in Lemuria and, sexism, which is at the heart of these women seeking power, and distrust in science, and all of these big societal things that we are wrestling with. How did you go about drawing those connections and discovering them? I mean, as I was reading the book, I kept thinking, oh my gosh, everything is all connected. I think I sent you that meme. So yeah, how did you kind of get there to tying all this together?
Well, it was just starting to try and understand, like, who came up with this idea of Lemuria? What is that? Like, and what I found, the unsung hero of this book are lemurs, which is not a thing I thought would, I would say. It is, so the idea of Lemuria was an idea that was floated by a zoologist before we understood how the Earth moves and continental drift and plate tectonics. It was an ornithologist who floated this idea that because there were lemurs in India and on Madagascar, there's this huge ocean in between them. There must have just been a continent there that sunk to the bottom of the ocean. So I was trying to understand how that became like a bad scientific theory and more of a spiritual idea. So I was able to just then connect that there were these people who carried that idea, who were like, oh, well then Lemuria must have been a lost spiritual civilization. There were people there, and they were blue, and they had eyes on the back of their heads. These are all real things in this book. So it was just about following the reporting and going back to the 1850s into, the wave of spiritualism that was big in America, big with early feminists and suffragists, and then just trying to basically take that baton forward in the relay race of human history. And okay, so where did it go next? And where it went was it became a thing where people who had really racist ideas could say, well, this is where the Aryan race was from, and they were the best race. And, then later in history, then people were like, picked it up and made it anti-Semitic. So to me, this is where it became a book of extremism, was where I was like, oh, pretty much anybody that wants to believe something hateful can just like come up with a way to make that feel comfortable to talk about. And for a lot of people in this book, it's through Lemuria, and it's through, ideas about ascended masters, and I feel like I'm just like saying insane things up here on stage, like just hearing myself talk.
It all makes sense when you read the book, guys.
I swear it makes sense.
Talking about the ascended masters, Robin Williams is a key ascended master.
Yes.
And that one's a little off the wall, like Cleopatra, and like, that makes sense. Like, very powerful historic woman, people look up to her.
Right.
Or like Joan of Arc. Can you talk about, I think you were fascinated by it. I was fascinated by it. Yeah.
Okay, so here's a little background. So Love Has Won had a system of people that they called galactics. These were kind of like, I grew up in the Catholic Church, so these are kind of like saints, like people you kind of pray to. The galactics in the Love Has Won belief system were Robin Williams, Chris Farley, Tupac Shakur, Whitney Houston. It was all these kind of dead celebrities. And again, when Amy Carlson died, this was like made a huge joke. And I also thought it was very funny. But in doing my reporting, I started to realize two things. One, this was a system that was passed through time. They used to be called masters, then they became ascended masters. And this is the thing, like Amy Carlson just took the idea and was like, let's call them galactics. We'll put them in space. So there was that. But then on the Robin Williams thing, specifically Kim, who I spoke to in the book, she made me understand that that was a great entry point, specifically for online members of the group. So here she is watching the Love Has Won live streams for 6 hours a day, sitting in the comments, chatting with other people, and they would start talking about Robin Williams. And people in the chat would say, oh, I love Robin Williams. I loved him in Mrs. Doubtfire. And, oh, I loved If Dreams May Come. It was a discussion point to get people talking, but it also made people think like, oh, they like what I like. They're also really sad that Robin Williams died. So to me, it took a lot of that, like, it just seemed so dumb before, but I could understand it through her eyes. It was just a way for her, she was looking for community. She was looking for people who understood her, felt that no one around her understood her. But here she had these people she could just chat about movies with, and oh yeah, Robin Williams' comedy was so profound to me too. So that's what it ended up becoming. So it was just one more kind of recruitment method. And especially for an online group, I think those kinds of things are really important to find common ground with people.
There was also a section with Kim. I guess Kim was my favorite person in this book.
Yeah.
Who she was messaging like a neighbor on Facebook and trying to explain her belief system. Like it seems like, you know, this person was genuinely reaching out to her to be like, hey, like I'd like to hear more, like, I don't know, checking on her or what. But looking at those messages, you know, you really get like she can't explain it.
Yeah.
And so how did you, I mean, what was it like when you talked to Kim about like rereading those messages? And I'm sure you read lots of content that was like, this doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, with Kim specifically, I think it was really hard for her. You know, I was really slow with her, and I was like, I really don't want to re-traumatize you, but I feel like you have a lot of knowledge that can help me understand, that can help me translate this. So she would share with me, you know, these messages and things, times that she wanted people in her life to come into the group. And this particular exchange is so sobering, I think, for her to read now, because her neighbor's like, I don't understand what you mean, but I'm here. I want to understand why this is powerful for you. And she kind of keeps explaining, and they don't ever figure anything out. Years later, after Kim leaves the group, I think she goes back and she was like, whoa, that was a different person. And also, like, I couldn't explain it because there was nothing to explain. I was basically just doing recruitment at that point for the group. And I think that on one hand, she's really grateful that she was ineffective in explaining what it was. But at the same time, just feels like that happened. And, you know, she was happy to talk to me, but it was also really difficult for her to kind of get in that place. Like, how did I get there?
You mentioned translating a lot of this stuff, and I know, and it's very evident in the book, that you did a ton of reading of other books, of just literature online, and how do you keep yourself sane and, you know, focused on the reporting when you are so deep into these spaces that are really hard to understand? I mean, I felt a little crazy reading this book in 2 days.
Sure.
So
yeah,
I don't know how you.
Yeah. I'm sorry for doing that to you. I don't know that I have a great answer that I am sane. I have a lot of knowledge about some pretty wacky stuff, but it keeps coming up. Like, I think that, you know, I finished this book a long time ago, and, you know, we just saw RFK dismantling our health department this week because of a lot of the ideas that I talk about in this book. So the timing, I think, was really good. I think that is helpful for me, that it's useful. But yeah, when I'm in the process of it, I'm just like talking about really wild stuff. And I have, you know, a very supportive husband who's willing to let me talk about Atlantis, only so much, you know. My friend Chuck is here tonight, and I thank him in the book. Like, we talked a ton about the topics in this book, and it's very helpful for me to have people who are like willing to go a little bit for a ride with me. But yeah, I don't know that I am sane. You would have to ask the other people in my life about it.
I think a lot of people who read books like this, they want like this answer of like, how do we prevent this from happening? And that's not something you seem to really try to get to. And I think it's always I think a lot of people want that from journalists. It's like, how do we fix this? So I guess, what do you think about that idea of like, how do I prevent this from happening to my loved one? Or how do I prevent, my best friend from joining a cult?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, I do think that it's been like writing about extremism has been a little bit of a long study in trying to find an answer and always feeling like I'm just getting further away from it. So yeah, I've stopped, I think, thinking I'm gonna like change the world and hopeful that I can just put forward something for someone if they're like, I'm interested in these ideas, but I don't see a book that feels credible on this. And that, I think, with New Ageism, that was like, I was kind of looking for a book because I got really interested in tarot cards in 2020, and I took a bunch of like art history classes and things like that about these things. And I'm just forever a journalist. Like, I can't trust that anything is okay for me to like believe in. And I just started to think, am I in like a tarot cult? Like, is this weird? And I was not, but I wanted to understand, like, is there a place where it becomes damaging, even for a person like me, that's very skeptical of everything? And I don't think that I found an answer, but I think what I found was that in times of fear, people are like very easily manipulated. Like, they're looking for answers. And a bunch of this book happens during COVID, and people, being stuck at home and looking online for quick answers to their problems or communities. And the New Age was thriving. Like, there were health coaches and gurus and, teachers willing to take your money and give you guidance and heal you. I don't know that there's any one thing that's like, oh, if your family member starts doing this or that. I mean, I think that this book is very like friendly to the woo in certain ways. Like, the organizational concept of the book is tarot cards. And I wanted to make that clear because I think that there's no harm in so much of this stuff. Like, if you have a crystal in your pocket and you're here, you're okay. Like, I don't think it's like a bad thing. But there are, like any spiritual practice, there are places where it becomes a little harmful. And I think that this book is kind of like it's like, I've called it like a spiritual life jacket a little bit. Like, pray but beware, I guess. Like, or if someone's saying, I can heal you, or I can make you spiritually enlightened for a price, that might be a thing to be skeptical of.
A lot of this happens in the Western United States. There is mention of, I don't know how to, Ramatha,
yeah,
who is in Washington, Yelm. So, I mean, is that just because you live here and that's what you're focused on, or do you think that there is a particular penchant for this kind of thing out west?
It's a little hard for me to answer because this is where I've always lived, so I don't totally know what I mean, I think that that's actually a question I get a lot. Why is the Northwest so extreme? And I'm like, is it? I mean, I don't know. Yeah, sure, there's a lot of extremism in Florida, in Michigan, and other places too. So I wanted to... Look, when you get a book contract, you only have so much money. So I couldn't travel super far. I think if I could have gone to India and like hung out with a yoga cult, I might have done that. But there are key points in this book. Mount Shasta is one of them. There's a lot around Mount Shasta. Ashland is a big place. Yelm only because Ramtha School of Enlightenment is there. So I thought, to me, I'm always trying to bring attention to our part of the world because I feel like it's chronically undercovered by, big media outlets, or it's covered really incorrectly. To me, I'm not really interested in writing about other parts of the world. Like, this is where I'm from, and I want to talk about it and talk about the things that I see. I grew up in Portland, lived in Oregon most of my life, and I hung out in Eugene a lot as a teenager. There's a lot of hippies there, and a lot of people who would seem like politically progressive who are pretty friendly to a lot of the ideas in this book. And like I say, it kind of intersects with the right. So I was trying to write about that nuanced culture that I see in the Northwest. Certainly there are other places in the country where this is a thing, but yeah, there's a reason why I think, California was always a place that was a real hotbed of spiritual progressivism and things like that. So part of that, I think, is because of like ideas that people have always had about the West, that you can go and break away from your, trappings of your whatever conservative spiritual ideas, or there's free land and things like that. So I think that there is a lot of this stuff happens in the West. So in this book, there's Mount Shasta, Ashland, stuff around Mount Rainier and Colorado, which are big hubs of this stuff.
You started off talking about, this book is largely about women and power, and I think Ramtha is a great example of that. I'm going to probably butcher this little explanation, but she's a woman who channels like a male
35,000-year-old Lemurian warrior.
There we go.
Who is a man.
So, what did you feel like you were discovering as you were reporting about how, these New Age and spiritual beliefs really, women are really drawn to them more so than men? And what were some lessons you learned about, women and power when it comes to New Age beliefs? I think that there is a theme of understanding female power in a lot of the work that I've done and in both books that I've written. I think part of this comes from my own, growing up in the Catholic Church, converting to Catholicism when I was 16 and really embracing some of their female saints, but then realizing later that I didn't feel like the Catholic Church actually gave me any power at all. And kind of going on a bit of a seeker's journey of my own. And that's something I've written about in regards to this book. So what I started to understand was that a lot of the women that I was writing about had kind of similar ideas, where they felt, very spiritual at a certain point in their life, but felt pushed away by their church, or like they couldn't practice spirituality in a way that felt really authentic to them. So all of the women in this book do what Helena Blavatsky, who was around in the 1850s, says. I'm going to butcher the quote, but she at one point was sort of found out as like a spiritual charlatan, and somebody asked her about it, and she was like, "Yeah, if I want to rule men, I have to deceive them." Duh. Like it was like a really, important statement on power. I think that she was just like, look, I'm just trying to play the game here, and so I have to just lie a little bit. And I thought, that's really interesting. And it's a thing that has been carried forward within the New Age movement of, women sort of claiming a certain kind of power. When it comes to writing about spiritual belief systems, like I found it's invalid to just say like, that's fake. That's not real. Like, because the spiritual experience may be really real to someone. So in the case of Ramtha, this is somebody who, Jay-Z Knight is her name. She channels Ramtha and runs this very successful school that has attracted celebrities for, decades to her channeling sessions and her wine ceremonies and things like that. Wasn't it like Salma Hayek who was there?
Salma Hayek at one point was a big follower. Shirley MacLaine, people from Dynasty. It was big in the 80s. But I think that that's interesting, to think about women who may, play the game and make grift off people and create an empire for themselves as a kind of spiritual goddess. And this book is not filled with good people, but it's filled with people who've been very successful in their spiritual zone, I guess.
Do you think, we've talked quite a bit about how Amy at the center of Love is One was kind of made fun of in documentaries and other coverage of her. And even like Helena Blavatsky, she admitted to this, and people are always after her, like, is this fake? Say it's fake. Do you think that that's like more common with like female leaders of these movements, like tell us it's fake, or joking about it versus a male leader of a movement like that?
Yeah, I don't know that I can answer that accurately. I think I think so. I mean, from the reporting that I did, certainly that seemed true, especially because in 2 cases, these were groups that were started by married couples where the man died and the woman took it forward into a really successful, business venture, but also became a goddess in the process. And they took a lot of heat. And so a lot of it was earned, for sure. They deserved the criticism that they got. Some of them were really predatory on other people. But yeah, I do always wonder where, applying a feminist lens was something that I even applied to Lori Vallow at first, where I was like, is this woman getting like really maligned because of the way she looks? And in some regards, I think that she was. And I think that that's okay to say and still call somebody a complicated person, but also recognize where like chauvinism misogyny is coming into the reporting about them. Yeah.
I mean, when you talk a lot about, people don't write about these things in a serious way. A lot of times people view it as frivolous. What do you think the value is in really approaching these ideas as a journalist and providing that piece of work for people?
I think that what that question makes me think of is that in the 1980s, J.Z. Knight was channeling Ramtha, and she was attracting thousands of people to her events, and she was doing them in Japan and Brazil and Germany and Mexico. Her books were translated into tons of other languages, and basically, everybody just made fun of it. Like, here's this crazy lady, let's put her on a talk show and have her channel this thing. And yeah, that may or may not be true, but I think what the media was really neglecting to see was that there were thousands of people coming and giving lots of money and moving across the country to be closer to her school. So I think that that's a good example where I think a lot of times in the coverage of this topic, there's just been a lot of like, ooh, weird, kooky lady, look at her, kind of a joke, and less like trying to understand why so many people are interested. So that's what I was trying to do, is try to understand people really believe this, and people really have believed this for a long time, and that's interesting to me. I think that says something about spirituality. I think it says something about power. It says something about what people are seeking. And yeah, I think that, I'm just interested in writing stories that I want to read, and I'm, kind of a weird person. So I, just I'm attracted to writing about things like this, and it turns out there are other people who are too.
Lots of other people
Yeah.
who are interested. Well, thank you so much for coming tonight and talking to us about your book.
Thank you.
So one of my favorite parts of the night is the audience Q&A. Can we bring the lights up? So let's ask our favorite questions about healing crystals.
I'm right back here so I can get you. Hello.
Can you talk to us about the actual lemurs, please?
Sure. Yeah, happy to. So I went and hung out with lemurs at the Oregon Zoo. It was one of the more fun parts of reporting this. But so the idea of Lemuria was floated, as this idea that was, found to be not real science. But by the time the Lemuria story, by the time the man who wrote this, theory died, he was kind of like, yeah, that actually probably wasn't, that was probably bad science. But at that point, the genie was out of the bottle, and it had been really picked up by people who were very angry about science at that time, and thinking that scientific discovery, specifically Darwin, was killing the spiritual mysteries of life. So the story, Lemuria became this vessel for people to just kind of pour their ideas into, and this idea that this great land was once here. What's really interesting is that I did a lot of lemur research, and they are this really amazing, exceptional animal that only lives on Madagascar. They're very precious. They like to sun themselves, and they look like yogis. They sit cross-legged and warm themselves in the sun. They're a matriarchal society, and I just thought that was so funny, because within New Ageism, they've created this fantasy tale where like women had power, and it exists. Like it's in this primate society that is very threatened by climate change. And I thought that was a really interesting thing about how the ridiculous stories we're willing to create and not see the reality of an amazing thing before our eyes. So there's a lot more about lemurs in the book, but that's what I'll say.
Okay, I'm over here. I'm sorry. How do you report on something so extreme and so out there with such grace and understanding when it is something that you consider, when you can't understand it yourself? Like, how do you wrap your mind around that when, like I always say, like, you know, you can't make logic of something that has no logic. Like, it's impossible to frame it that way. So how do you report on it like that?
That's a really good question. I mean, like, I think Love Has Won is a great example. Like, I watched like hundreds of hours of live streams, and I cannot really discern much knowledge from any of it. I think it's like anything when you're a journalist and you're interviewing somebody and they're like intentionally avoiding a question, you can kind of just say like, you're not being direct. Like, why can't you answer this directly? So to me, it became less about the words that they were saying, but what was the repeated messages that they were saying. So I think Love Is One is like a great example of this. The things that they were talking about a lot were Robin Williams. They were talking a lot about Trump and how he was Amy Carlson's father when she was the Queen of Lemuria, and that's why they should worship him. They were talking a lot about Jewish anti-Semitic conspiracy theories. So to me, it was like, well, if that's the those are the messages I'm hearing the most often, that this is a group that very much mimics the anti-government militia groups that I've written about, or the sovereign citizens. It's just they're wearing like, you know, yoga pants and talking about crystals also. So I think that was it. I think that it's just, it's a weird world. And there was a lot where I was like, I don't know what this is, and so I'm probably not going to put it in the book. I mean, there's quite a lot that did not go in. I have a lot of very weird books on my shelf now.
What kind of weird books are you reading when you're not, researching?
I mean, I read a lot of fiction on the side, which I think is helpful, when you're trying to write a nonfiction book that moves, like you're learning about plot and like what good cliffhangers are and things like that. So, I mean, I was not reading a lot of nonfiction when I was working on this.
Questions in the back? Right over here.
Hi. I wanted to ask about conspiracy theory and working as a journalist, when often journalists are part of the they that groups like this are so worried about. And particularly in New Age, there's kind of like, it's layers of conspiracy on top of one another. And I just wonder about building trust as a journalist in that.
Yeah, I've just sort of learned there's some people that are just automatically not going to talk to you. But I think I try to always just say, like, look, I'm trying to understand this thing. I understand, like, your group has been written about a lot, and I'm kind of curious what other people got wrong. A lot of times I start with that, because I'm, like, the last journalist usually to arrive to a situation, so I'll just say, like, what'd they all get wrong? Generally, people are pissed off about something that was written about them, or, it could be a big or a small thing. And that's not to pander to people, it's just to sort of, like, I understand my industry really well. I understand how things can be misconstrued or generalized for an audience. So there's that. I tend to do really long interviews with people, so I'll give people a lot of time to explain themselves and feel heard. And I also am really willing to show up in person. I think just in our online world, and especially in journalism, people are really pressed for time. You're going to do a phone interview, you're going to do it over Zoom. I'll go fly to meet somebody if I feel like we can sit down and I can learn something. And I think there's just a lot of trust when you're willing to say, like, hi, this is my face. Like, I'm not as scary as you think I am, and I'm willing to talk to you about Lemurians and lemurs for 2 hours. So, I think that goes a long way. Sometimes, though, with it, like you're saying with conspiracy theories, you got to sift through a lot of stuff. And I think that is one benefit that I maybe don't have, but I do require, is just like a lot of time to do a lot of research and, go all the way down to the bottom of the rabbit hole to try to understand a thing, and maybe come back out not really understanding it much better, but giving myself an education in the process.
Don?
I'm really looking forward to reading this, and it's like, I believe that we're in this age of the mega grifter, and that's what, it's piquing my interest that that's what these folks are, even if they believe it themselves.
Yeah, I think one really useful term that I heard when I was reporting this was that this is like pastel QAnon, is what it's called. It's like the aesthetics are softer and a little more feminine, but the ideas are the same. And, that's one thing that really surprised me was like to understand like some of, one time I went and interviewed a guy who tried to blow up a building because of his ideas of, his far-right ideas. And some of the people that I talked to for this book were, pastel, loose, braids in their hair, and they were saying the same thing. So I thought that was really interesting. The aesthetics are different, but the ideas are identical.
Right here?
Yeah, thanks. This is interesting. I have a question about, do the leaders of these things, do they really believe what they're selling? And also, like with Lemuria, I haven't read the book yet, but how does that whole mythology get set up? Does somebody actually sit down with a map and say, okay, this is how the lemur's going to act over here? And I mean, it seems like at some point that's got to, all those rumors and those stories have to start somewhere. And where do they start,
Well, I think that probably the Lemuria thing is a little too long for me to answer, because it's like a process over generations of like moving Lemuria around the planet to make it more conveniently fit your belief system, which happens. And as far as if people really believe it, I mean, I think my mind wants to answer that in two ways. On one regard, does it matter? Do I have to ask if people really believe it? People can believe whatever they want to believe, and I try not to judge when anything that I do. Like, if someone believes something, that's their right to believe it. On the other hand, I will say that all of these people in this book have to believe it because it's their lifestyle. So they're not going to admit to me if they don't believe a thing. They believe it enough that other people want to come and live near them, or give them their money, or give them their 401k so they can enlighten them. So yeah, it behooves them to really believe it.
Last question, unless somebody flags me now. Okay.
Some of my favorite pieces about your work and your investigations are when it accidentally overlaps. Is there an example of that with this new book?
Yeah, so part of the genesis was I was interested in, this kind of the vibes I was feeling in Portland and some of my own interests and conversations with people in my own life. But, Chad Daybell and Lori Vallow had these, who were the subjects of my last book, they had these spiritual meetings in people's homes where they were talking about fringe Mormon ideas, but they were also using a crystal pendulum to discern. So, even for people who don't have crystal pendulums in their life, this is a thing that's often sold in New Age bookstores, and it's like, hold out your hand and ask a question, and if the pendulum swings one way, that means yes, and if it goes in a circle, it means no. And I thought, oh, that's interesting that these people who are, very, very conservative, and they have these very far-right religious ideas, are also deploying this thing. So obviously, Mormonism has kind of these wooey beginnings with, finding golden plates and treasure hunting and things like that. But yeah, there was a lot of crossover there. And then, in a more modern moment, I think Love Has Won is just like answering. If people have questions about like how we got here, I think that a group like that is a big answer. And it's doubts over the systems that we're all told we have to just take. So like the healthcare system, or that, I think that's a big one, especially during COVID. You've started to find a lot of common cause about vaccines and things like that within the far right and far left. So yeah, there's a ton of overlap, and I thought this felt like I was saying earlier, I was trying to advance the conversation on extremism, I learned a lot doing this.
Well, let's thank Leah and Emma. That was great.
Thank you.
Really great.
Thank you so much.